Welcome to the Data Center Hawk podcast. I'm Mike Netzer, joined as always by David Liggett, Data Center Hawk CEO and founder, coming to you from DCH HQ in Dallas, Texas. David, how are you doing this morning?
I'm great, thank you.
Yes, today's podcast is brought to you by Donut Palace for all your donut needs at Coit and Beltline.
That's right.
It's Friday. It's
That's
Donut
right.
Day. We do need some sponsors for this podcast.
Gosh.
That'd be so great. I can't imagine who would come out of the woodwork for that.
Never know, Mike.
Okay, so today we're talking about how demand has shifted geographically within the United States, because there's been some very interesting trends that have developed in the last few years, and I think we wanted to kind of think through what does that look like. There's some different ways in which we see that those shifts happening, and so I think we want to talk through those today, kind of setting the scene for that. You think back 5 years, right? Co-location, really, and hyperscale were kind of had some key centers throughout the U.S. Major markets, and then some, I'll call them like hyperscale developments that were large but not near or adjacent to kind of traditional colo markets. So Council Bluffs, Iowa, Des Moines, Boardman, Oregon. Obviously Virginia is one, but that was also adjacent to the colo market there as well. But you look in the last 5 years alone, about 18,550 megawatts of capacity have been added to the North America data center market. And so that has really changed, as you know, how groups are able to deploy. And so I want to talk through kind of what that looks like. So from your standpoint, kind of what are the different ways you've seen groups get really creative around finding places to put their deployments?
Yeah, the main driver of all of this is the requirement sizes have grown so much over the last 3 years that a stereotypical power company, to handle a requirement that was 300 megawatts or 400 megawatts that they were not planning on, is really a hard thing to figure out. So it's pushed, as you mentioned, the activity to geographic locations that we traditionally have not seen, and each one of those places, there's different solutions that are happening to fit, what the perceived need is. I'm of the belief that you can fix the power problem in certain places, but you fix one problem and you get another one. And so, you can take, if there are markets that have, utility power that's available and significant amount of utility power, that solves that problem. But you could have a labor problem with that. You could have some sort of tax incentive challenge with that in markets or states that might not traditionally attract data center development. Okay,
so let's talk about kind of from most common to maybe least common, the different ways which groups are, again, getting creative. So I think the first one would be like one of the things we've seen, and we've talked about in this podcast, is like the submarket spread within what we call established colo markets. You see a spread outward.
Yes.
And that it can be very specific submarkets, but talk about what you've seen in that regard as far as groups going kind of maybe outside the normal core of an established data center market and where they're going. Yeah.
And this is happening really in major data center markets. I'm speaking specifically in the United States. So Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, Phoenix, Northern Virginia, Northern California. I mean, those are your 6 largest data center markets in the U.S. off the top of my head. And each one of those has a different story around different geographic places that demand is now moving. And data centers like to cluster. So if you look on a map, for instance, if you look at one market, you will see dots of the locations all in different, different facilities, but almost in the same areas based on power availability, connectivity. And so if there's one area that works for one data center user or one data center operator, it typically will work for others. No, that's not always the case.
It's good for the goose is good for the gander.
Don't hate on me here, yes, commentary-wise, but most of the time that makes sense. So let's talk about the different markets and where we're seeing this happening, because this is the most common shift that's going on right now. We sit in Dallas. So in Dallas specifically, historically, all of the demand in the data center space had really been north of the Dallas city limits. It had all been in areas like Richardson, Garland, far north Dallas, Plano, even over to Fort Worth in the Alliance area.
Irving.
Yes. 3 to 4 years ago, we started to see land purchasing down south of Dallas. So this is in areas like Red Oak. If you take 35 down south, you run into Midlothian, Red Oak, Lancaster, some areas like that. And that's where we've seen the growth start happening. So in the last 3 years, we've seen a lot of land purchasing there. What we're seeing now is even shift from there. Mm-hmm. So now if you look at a map and you go to the west, there's areas like Midlothian. This is almost like south between Dallas and Fort Worth. That's an area that's starting to see data center interest. If you go to the other, if you go to the east, there's an area, Kaufman and some of those areas, we're starting to see data center activity. So here we are, Dallas, major market. We had a shift to the South Dallas, and now we're seeing a shift from there. Mm-hmm. That's one example.
And where do you see that maybe going next? Continue east-west, continue south?
I think you'll see it continuing to go south. The reason I think that is because, 35 from Dallas to Waco, and Waco's the home of Baylor University, one of the greatest colleges in all of the United States.
Are you familiar with
that? Yeah, I went to Baylor. Anyway.
Baylor graduate.
That's right. But if you go basically like Dallas to Austin, for those that aren't familiar, that's about 180 miles, so 3 hours. So Waco's right in the middle of that. But I think you'll see a lot of growth along that corridor. There's power, obviously, that's associated with that area, and then there's also a lot of connectivity. Mm-hmm. So if you can almost like take that 35 corridor and go east or west off of that, you have the infrastructure that most of it's already there. Mm-hmm. There'd be additional infrastructure that would need to be brought in, but you've already got the bones of a really good infrastructure set up. So I think it's probably like south that way. If you think about a market like Phoenix, what we basically, I've talked about this on the podcast before, but think of Phoenix like a clock, 12, 3, 6, 9. Really the activity we've seen has been on the 3 and the 9 area. Mm-hmm. So the 3 is Mesa, and that's where the Elliott Road corridor is. There's been a lot of activity there. On the flip side, on the other side of the 9, you've got Goodyear, and that's where there's been a lot of activity. But we're seeing like that start to spread out into areas like Glendale, El Mirage. There's like all these different areas starting to really bubble up as data center areas that could be attractive. All this depends on where power is available and how quickly power can be delivered to a site. Mm-hmm. That's what's pushing these areas from a growth perspective is getting those sites to the market faster. And where you can do that, all of a sudden you can have a submarket cluster. Atlanta, it's Lithia Springs has always been kind of a popular enterprise data center area, but now we're starting to see Fayetteville, areas like Conyers, start to have larger data center developments. Northern Virginia, it's down the 95 corridor. Mm-hmm. Chicago, it's, you can really only go west of Chicago, but it's starting to be even further west and actually to the north. There's a data center operator that just acquired land in an area called Grays Lake, and I think they can do I think I saw only 480 megawatts.
Oh, that's it. That's cute.
And that's obviously, we're joking, that's a lot of power. And that's to the north about, I think, 30 minutes. So, again, this is a really popular strategy. It's happening. I think you'll continue to see it happen.
And it's kind of a safer of the strategies we'll look
Absolutely.
at. It's the lowest risk because you've got an ecosystem there. You've got customers there. You've got other operators there.
That's right. And it's no secret that if you find an area or a city that data center users, large users, have bought land in and they have infrastructure in, and there's another opportunity to expand in that market, that's something they have done in the past, and they'll probably continue to do so. To your point, it's a much safer strategy than some of the other things that we'll talk about.
I just have this picture of like data center executives like hacking through the bush, like Indiana Jones style.
Feels like it.
And opening up, and there's like a big substation there, and they're like, I found the lost substation of Elk Grove Village.
I mean, it's
the gleams in their eyes.
Yeah, the other thing I would say, and this is probably the right place to say this in our time this morning, which is the projections of power growth over the next 5 to 10 years. Yesterday we had Jonathan Schildkraut with Compass.
Stay tuned for that one. Yeah, when that drops.
That's right. It's a great conversation, but he had some really interesting thoughts around like capacity growth and demand, and that's our world that we're in right now. It is where is power? How quickly can power be brought to the site? And all that constraint, all those challenges and issues is what's creating the opportunity in the space today.
Well, you just think about how drastically this has impacted the power community. I mean, I think a lot of people are aware of some of the stories that came out in the last 6 months about power companies that had basically had relatively flat to 3% growth for decades.
Yeah.
And now they're projecting 20, 30, 40% growth.
Yeah, and we really have there's some more, not just the data center space, but there's a lot more challenges as like a country that the U.S. is going to need to figure out, and really probably the world. Yeah, like how we use power, what power is allocated for what type of industry, et cetera. I mean, there's probably some hard questions coming for our industry and the world related to, power transmission and power generation.
Yeah, that's a separate pod, but
that's right. It's our doomsday pod.
It's pod adjacent to this pod.
That's our pod. Yeah. If you basically just stay on this podcast for another 20 minutes, it's just silence, and then it picks up, and that's our doomsday.
It's like the hidden
pod.
track on CDs. Kids, back in the day when Dave and I were kids, CDs
compact
were physical circles.
Yeah, people are like,
that contained music.
Get back to data centers. Y'all aren't funny.
I miss CDs.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. All right. Trend number 2 we're working on. So this is the idea of going to like non-established data center markets or non-existent data center markets that have the power.
Yeah.
And so talk about like a couple examples of that and who are the types. So I think skipping back to number 1, that submarket spread within established markets. You see that between both the co-location operators and the hyperscale.
Yes.
Kind of both pursuing that strategy. Yep. This strategy is a little different. So groups going to like rural markets, some that you're probably aware of, some that people may not be. And who's kind of doing that development? Yeah,
I'm glad you brought up the 2 different groups, because this is probably a key differentiation between the first one and the second one that we're talking about. And that is, there are areas across the United States that have attributes and different components that would attract someone today that wouldn't have years ago. And the number one is like the amount of utility power that can be delivered quickly. So in the last, I'd probably say 12 to 18 months, we've seen hyperscale users buy land in areas like Jackson, Mississippi, El Paso, Texas, Birmingham, Alabama, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Mm-hmm. All those areas represent this category, which would be more, somewhat rural areas that have the infrastructure needed to meet the large demand that's out there today. Typically co-location operators will not go buy land in these markets because there's not the groups they historically have served would not find those markets where they want to put a 2 megawatt or 4 megawatt co-location deployment. That's changed a bit because there's more data center operators chasing the bigger requirements. So if one of these hyperscale users goes and buys land in one of these markets, there's the belief that they would expand again. Mm-hmm. And so co-location operator goes, hey, listen, if instead of chasing the Fortune 500, now I'm literally trying to do business with 10 companies, mm-hmm. and those 10 companies are buying land in these markets, I'll go buy land there too, because that could make sense for me down the road if those are the customers that I'm going after. And these are the areas that I think are really interesting today, because if you look back in the space 15 years ago, these were the areas where these companies were doing this. Mm-hmm. They were actually buying land in areas like Des Moines, Iowa, Omaha, Nebraska. You mentioned Boardman, Oregon, areas in North Carolina, rural North Carolina, where there was like the textile industry had gone away, and so there's a lot of power, there's a lot of water. That's where all the big deals were going. Then in 2011, 2012, they all started needing to be next to the eyeballs near the bigger cities. Mm-hmm. So that brought the co-location market into those deals. And now those groups still want to be, the hyperscale users still want to be in the larger markets, but now they also want to be in these more secondary or tertiary markets.
Yeah, I think those groups have the benefit of having such a large amount of demand.
Yeah.
They can segment it out and say what things need to be in major markets, what things need to be in the eyeballs, and what things don't.
Yep.
So they have the luxury, it's not a luxury, but I mean the ability with their kind of the maturity of their infrastructure to go, okay, we can put stuff in, Birmingham, Alabama, or wherever. I think that's probably benefited them in the last couple of years to go, okay, they're kind of, again, it's the maturity of the product.
Yeah, and I think the AI discussion or part of the growth comes into that discussion, because if you think about the language learning that's going on, mm-hmm. and the type of power that takes versus the inference, and how the different applications there, and what you can put in rural markets and what you need to have closer to the end user. That's really interesting as well. The other thing I would say about these markets is, and actually I go back to that podcast I had yesterday with Jonathan. He made a great point about, these areas might look like rural markets or places that historically have not landed power growth, but some of these areas sit on connectivity backbones throughout the United States. So while they might not seem like, hey, this is not a Dallas or Chicago or Phoenix, Northern Virginia, but they do have attributes that maybe you wouldn't necessarily think just by, going, hey, we don't see a lot of data center growth in El Paso, Texas, but it's got power and it's got connectivity. And you got those two things right now, you got an option for the data center space.
Yeah. All right, next one is one that I think we've seen not pursued en masse, but potentially could be. Actually, let me jump back to number 2. The other thing I would point out about those rural markets is that this is one of those trends that there are likely multiple other markets that have not been, pursued by these groups yet.
Yeah.
Across the country that, that have the attributes you describe that could be, you're just going to pop. Like, for example, the Jackson, Mississippi, Amazon deal. They caught a lot of people by surprise. Maybe not people who are really deep in it, but I wouldn't be surprised if you see other markets like that were not on anybody's radar, and then these groups go and announce, several thousand megawatt deployment there.
Yeah, I mean, you can't have the growth projections that our industry has and not go to places like this, because it can't happen. I mean, the growth can't go to the Dallases and the Chicagos and the Phoenixes alone, because it can't handle that.
Yeah, think about Jackson, Mississippi. I think it's around 2 gigawatts total deployment, total size. I mean, that crushes any market outside of Virginia, even that one. Anyway, so yeah, you're going to see more of that.
When you say that crush, you mean the size of that compared to
that doubles every market except for Virginia.
Right. That's
right. So in that one deployment. Okay, so next solution is one that we've seen that, again, may be the beginning, the tip of the iceberg of a new trend, and it's the idea of outright acquiring a power plant. Let's just call it what it is. And so the Amazon announcement that they purchased a nuclear power plant in Susquehanna, Pennsylvania, that potentially could be the start of a trend of more groups doing that. Maybe it's not all nuclear, maybe it's coal or nat gas, but kind of what are your thoughts on that as far as that becoming a longer-term trend?
Yeah, I think that every large data center user and co-location operator that's serving those companies are evaluating alternative energy solutions. And this is one of the solutions that could work. And I don't think this shows you the different environment that we're in. We were talking about this yesterday. It's like, I used to do site selection evaluation years and years and years ago. And, one of the risk assessment we would do is like distance away from nuclear power plants. Now we're going to the nuclear power plant, so things have changed quite a bit.
How the tables have turned.
That's right. And I don't some of the risk assessment we used to do was a little overboard, to be honest. But I actually have a really funny story about this. One time I was doing a risk assessment on a project. I think it was in Dallas, and the user had asked us to put a dot around every major or regional airport and do like a 5-mile radius or something. And I was thinking to myself, I was like, I don't know if there's going to be much land left to do anything. So I had
Field, DFW,
so I had
McKinney Airport.
Yes, I mean, there's a lot. Actually, there's a lot more smaller little, regional airports, whatever. Anyway, I do this thing for this guy, and he's like, we can't build anywhere close to this. I'm like, hey, you can't build in Dallas, man. I'm like, there is literally no land available. Anyway, I'll get off that.
Maybe if you would have pushed him south of Dallas 10 years ago.
Right, I would have been ahead of the time.
Very differently.
I would not be here.
Better be lucky than good, I guess.
That's right. All that to say, because we've had other challenges in the space, the risk assessment approach has changed. And I, rightfully so in some areas. But this is a really good example of, a large user figuring out another way to, get access power that's either readily available and put yourself directly next to, where the power is. And I think that's it's a speed to market opportunity. It's a large scale opportunity from a power perspective. I don't know if this works for every group and every user, but this illustrates another type of solution that we're seeing today. And I think that we'll have to, I don't want to get into all like the different types of energy and renewables, but one thing was really interesting in early April. I think it's Rocky Mountain Power came out and said they were going to shut down, I think 2 or 3 coal plants. And they basically came back and said, we're not shutting them down. We've looked at our power estimates. They're larger than we thought, and we'll shut them down in 2030 something and 2042, like we originally had planned. Oh yeah, and we're not going to do this type of, I think it was maybe nuclear power or something. So the power companies are shifting their approach because they're looking at the demand from a lot of these data center groups and others going, we've got to change here, and it's not going to be probably as green as we would like.
As green as we would have hoped
because the demand is so large. And so everybody's got to come to grips with that. I don't think people are going to start like focusing less on how do we use renewable energy and how do we do things similarly to how we have from a like an approach standpoint, but you can't have it both ways. Like you can't grow the way the industry wants to grow and be green the way the industry wants to or needs to be. So there's going to have to be some maybe give backs there on some things.
And again, I think to your point about the coal plants, I heard this. There's an Odd Lots podcast. People know I'm a big fan of Odd Lots, but they had a power guy on, and he made the comment of like, their power plants that were going to be shut down, and if it's for political reasons only, those decisions will probably be reversed. Yeah. To your point about the Rocky Mountain Power, and so, or if they do shut them down, then maybe some other group comes in and purchases them and kind of keeps them going.
Yes, but those are all, I think you bringing up this is a great example of different types of ways to solve this challenge. And so this is going to push demand to places that historically has not seen data center demand. I've done this now for a long time, and I can't think of another data center deal that's gone to, is it
Susquehanna?
Yes.
Pennsylvania. I just like to say that word. It's a fun word. It's got to be an old Algonquin word or something. Right. But okay, so next one would be the idea of self-generation, which is related to the kind of power plant acquisition, but on a lower scale. Yeah. We're not going to buy a power plant. We're going to build one. Yeah. And so looking at that could be natural gas, probably not coal at this point. Could be modular nuclear reactor. But that one, I think we're probably starting to see get some legs. I feel like I've heard it more and more lately that it's at least being entertained. We look like a Bloom Energy, another on-site generation type of company, and I'm sure there's others, but that seems to be one that I'm hearing more and more these days. Yeah,
if you think about the Susquehanna, Pennsylvania deal, hey, let's go to where the power is. This is let's bring the power to us. Yeah. Let's figure out how to bring these solutions to where we are. And there's no clear solution at this point. And I'm not an energy expert by any means, so I'm sure those that are maybe rolling their eyes at these comments, and that's fine. But I think that each group is trying to figure out, hey, what does make sense, and can we bring these solutions to solve this problem? But I think you've got to figure out financially if it still fits the model. And some of this stuff I think right now is too expensive. It takes too long. I mean, there's can you get community support? Think about the issues that we have the industry has right now with getting plans approved or permits approved to do data center development, let alone going back to those groups and saying, hey, by the way, we want to put small nuclear reactors on the site. That doesn't really enhance that process. So there's not a clear-cut solution here, but I think there is progress being made, and the both the commentary around the work that's being done, and I think the understanding is getting better. It's just going to take a while. There's no fast solutions here, and that's why our industry is really interesting right now. That's why
buying a nuclear power plant is kind of a fast solution. Well, that might be the fastest of all the solutions.
Sure, I guess.
But you're right.
It's like that's what makes this industry so interesting to be a part of. I think for anyone, for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, it's like I've said this before, the problems can't fix themselves fast. And if you are looking at the data center space like a commercial real estate asset class, there might be some on this podcast that don't, but for those that do, you compare this market to the others, and the opportunities here are going to exist for a long time.
Yeah, I think it just
They're just
continues to
expensive.
underscore the dynamic nature of the space and how it's what's true today was not true 2 years ago. It was true 2 years ago, was not true 4 years ago. And so it just underscores how creative, and I wouldn't use the word desperate, but it is kind of, there's some desperation or there's some extreme pressure to deliver in the face of the demand we're seeing. And you're going to see groups, I think, continue to get more and more creative.
Yeah.
Last trend is one where we've seen groups look for data centers that have maybe an expansion capability, either I'll call a Class B colo space or an enterprise data center that can be acquired and then expanded upon. And that's one very specific group. So talk about that trend and where maybe you're seeing that happen geographically.
Yeah, before like 2008 and 2009, groups used to, like banks, insurance companies, they used to buy buildings and convert them into their own data centers. They would own and operate them themselves. And that trend shifted over time to where less companies did that because they could use colocation, they could use cloud, all that stuff. But there are still companies that own data center buildings that might have more power than they need. You know, the traditional IT group historically would always over provision what they think they would need because they weren't sure what the future was going to be. So the last thing I would want is to be in a facility that they couldn't add additional power to. So there are buildings throughout the United States that were built, 10, 15, 20 years ago that you might have a insurance company that owns the building, that there's 6 to 8 megawatts of IT infrastructure there, and they're only using 3. So you basically have 5 megawatts of stranded, or not stranded, but power that's available for someone to use. So we've seen some groups, if I think about there's a number of like AI, GPU, like providers that have come in and bought those buildings and then either had that user step out of that capacity, so they now had the full capacity. That's something that we've seen. We've also seen them buy that and then expand. So maybe it's like, hey, we'll take the 5 or 8 megawatts now, and in the next 3 years, we can build another building and get 20, 25. I think that's a really interesting approach, and we've seen that done in a number of different markets. I mean, the challenge right now, if you have one of these buildings and it doesn't cater to, there's not enough power there, historically you would compete with, you would think, well, gosh, if there's 3 megawatts available, why wouldn't someone just buy this space? And we haven't seen that happen yet. There really has to be that expansion opportunity where they can take it to, I would say, double-digit power, like at least 10 megawatts, something like that.
And that's something that I think we've only seen with some of those AI companies. Have you seen it with any other groups?
Not yet, off the top of my head. I mean, it is someone that's got a significant need for power, and they're looking at the landscape and going, hey, if we don't do this now, what does this look like in 2 years or 3 years?
Yeah.
But that's another strategy that we've seen play out that we didn't see this, 5 years ago. This is not happening. I mean, these buildings would either sit, and the question was kind of like, what is the industry going to do with these older enterprise data centers?
All right, this has been great. I think there's probably additional trends that we didn't cover that if we do this pod again in 6 or 12 months, I think it's going to look very different. And that's kind of the great part about being in this space is it's constantly changing. Yeah. But we are obviously tracking this, making sure that, where this is happening, we're on top of it. And so if this was interesting to you, obviously come check out datacenterhawk.com for more info. Everything we talked about today is part of the research we do every day as far as understanding where these developments are happening, who are the groups involved, what are the dynamics that are taking place there. So thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time.